Morning, and it is the 30th of November. This is an exceptional program. We don't normally broadcast anymore on a Thursday, but we have two programs for you. Napoleon at his very worst or very best with the two Bs, and John Henty later on in the morning, who undoubtedly will want to tell us all again about Max Miller. But first of all, good morning, Richard.
Good morning, Keith. I have to tell you this, that since our last broadcast and your revelation about your past in Vancouver, I had a hospital appointment. Nothing bad, just a checkup. And the doctor examined me and then said, would you mind rolling over, Mr. Barton, because I want to look at your Keith. And apparently that is now a medical term for the buttocks.
Well, somebody who'd be interested in that is here. Good morning.
Yes. Well, I'm not sure he's that interested in buttocks, but there we go. Morning, Phil.
Good morning, Keith and Ernest. How are you both?
Yeah, fine.
Well, thank you. On top of your story, Richard, when I first went for physiotherapy for my Parkinson's, they taught me how to lie on the bed and roll to get off. And the lovely physiotherapist, who was a cutie, said, which side do you sleep on, Keith? And I looked up at her and gazed in her eyes and said, it depends who I'm sleeping with.
You are quite simply a rogue.
Yes. I think we're gradually drawing that out of him, Philip, during the course of these calls.
Well, you've called it a hinterland of as yet unknown material.
Who can say what we're going to find out in months to come?
Well, I think you're going to start, aren't you, with the national day that it is.
It is St. Andrew. Yeah. So let's do that. It's St. Andrew's Day, patron saint of Scotland, amongst other places, and as somebody of Scots heritage, I will celebrate it. But Keith, you ought to also celebrate it, because Andrew, brother of Peter, the rock upon which I will build my church, as Jesus called him, according to the Gospel of John, introduced Peter to Jesus. So had it not been for Andrew, there wouldn't have been a Christian church, and you wouldn't get to guzzle communion wine for free every Sunday.
Wow.
So, you ought to be grateful for that.
Oh, yeah. What a let-off. What an escape.
Yeah. I mean, for somebody, Richard, who eschews any form of religion,
I do.
Your biblical knowledge is pretty good.
Let me make a confession. Nowhere near in the Keith envelope of confessions. When I was in the sixth form, I joined the school Christian Union. Actually, this is a bit Keith, because it was.
This is very Keith for you.
Yeah, it was.
I'm all ears.
It was 90% sixth form women who were in the Christian Union, and so I was, Jesus, yeah. I'll make you say Jesus if you want me to. Don't you worry. Yeah.
You were lucky. You had it over me. I went to an all-boys school.
Oh, that explains so much about the buttocks, if I may say.
So, albeit for entirely sexual motives, you became a God Squad.
I went deep undercover, and under a whole lot of covers, mainly duvets.
Deep under the covers, yes.
When their parents were away. Yeah, that's what I did. Yeah.
Now, and the somebody other thing, died today or in the night, didn't they, Richard?
Yes, you tell us, Phil.
Well, Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
100 years old. One of the all-time political greats. renewed ties with China, which led to Nixon going there.
Yeah.
And about which an opera was written. I only found that out this morning.
Nixon in China?
Nixon in China.
Yeah. Phil, your lack of cultural knowledge goes before you. Yeah.
Yes, and after me as well.
Yeah.
But I wonder if Keith ever met Henry Kissinger.
No, I did not. I brushed past him on one occasion because I was in Washington, D.C., and I went to the Cosmos Club, which is twinned with the Travelers Club, of which I was a member. And he was on the way out. He was one of the great members of that. But there was a lovely, very black lady who was a receptionist with startling coloured nails, who, at the moment I walked in, said, "Welcome to the Cosmos Club. Ah, a fellow countryman of yours," and it wasn't a fellow countryman of yours, "is a member of this club, Mr. Sean Connery," she said.
Oh.
Sean Connery.
Henry Kissinger disappeared into absolute background. Mr. Sean Connery was the key member of that club.
Yeah.
And let me guess, you've interviewed Sean, have you?
No, never met him. Never met him. There, you see, you found a chink in my armor.
Phil, you've given us all the positives about him, and it's sad that he's passed away, albeit he was 100, Kissinger. But there was a rather more negative side. He was deemed to be responsible for the deaths of huge hundreds of thousands of people in Cambodia.
Yeah.
And his policy of, it's an old term, realpolitik. So you just do what you think's for the best. You have no real moral compass about it. Permitted him to do that. There was a lovely quote from Tom Lehrer. You won't know who Tom Lehrer is, Phil. Keith, you might know.
No, because I'm culturally ignorant.
Exactly. Tom Lehrer, American academic, 95 years of age, but also wrote some very, very clever songs. So he was the one he wrote the song called "The Elements," which was to the tune of the Modern Major General song from the Pirates of
yes, and it's sung very quickly.
Very quickly, and it lists all the. But the other thing, what Tom Lehrer said, which was just beautifully summed it up. He said, "Political satire is now obsolete, given that Kissinger has got the Nobel Peace Prize."
Exactly right. Because he also had no time for human rights.
No.
He was a pretty controversial character, Henry Kissinger.
Yes.
He was in cahoots with Nixon.
Yeah. It will be interesting to consider how, in due course, history will treat him. But there we go. Anyway, talking about how history treats people, I think, Philip, that the last time we spoke on our topic, which is Napoleon, we rather unkindly left him riding his horse from Moscow with an ever diminishing army.
That's where we left him, as illustrated quite literally by a rather dramatic painting of him on his horse with a dishevelled, freezing band of soldiers behind him.
Marengo the horse. Yeah. and it was a disaster. He ruined France. He lost all power. The Allied forces invaded France, and he was taken into custody.
Yes, he lost his first battle on European soil.
Yes.
Which was at Leipzig. The Austrians beat really rather easily a very, very, as you say, reduced imperial army.
Well, the Imperial Army were running one way and the Austrians were kicking them up the Keith, weren't they?
I think that's right. Maybe Keith was there. Maybe he's interviewed Napoleon. I don't know.
I think. Sorry, Keith, you tell us.
I just missed him, I'm afraid.
No.
Only just.
Did you interview his horse Marengo, or did you, one clip clop for yes, two clip?
No,
I,
as I said to you earlier, Richard, I popped in to see Josephine, who was lovely.
Keith, seriously, there's a theme here. But it was an odd position because he had been this awful dictator as far as Europe was concerned, who had terrorized a number of countries, laid waste to huge parts of Central Europe and Russia when he was there.
Well, he burned Moscow.
Yeah, and
he was cold. He needed a fire.
Yeah, and as we said previously, he was the subject of terrifying little sort of nursery rhymes that British people told their children about Boney coming to get them. And there was real fear that he would. But given all...
the French army in the retreat committed dreadful atrocities.
Yeah.
As illustrated by War and Peace.
Yeah.
In particular. Yeah. The thing about
I'm sorry, I may well have interfered with what you were saying there. We had a little bit of a technical hitch. Away you go again. Yeah, you're okay now.
I can't remember which bit. You may not have heard.
You were talking about the atrocities on the retreat from Moscow.
Yes. Not dissimilar to the way the Japs and the Nazis treated their prisoners and forced them on these death marches. Yeah. So they didn't fall back into the hands of the Allies or the Soviets as they then were.
I suppose just reflecting upon that, atrocities by the French, but in fact, the Allies treated Napoleon in 1814, once he'd surrendered at that time, incredibly mildly.
Well, it was more than mild. Elba, where he was sent to, he was basically given the governorship of Elba.
And that's an island. That's an island in the middle of the Mediterranean.
Correct. And what I never realised.
Sorry.
I researched it.
Yeah.
Well, you're now going Norman Collier, Richard.
No, I'm not.
He's frozen.
Am I frozen?
No, you're fine.
Right.
The odd thing about sending him to Elba, as you say, and you can give us the details of it, is of course that he was born on Corsica in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, he was.
There would have been many people on the islands in the Mediterranean who were massively supportive of him, even then.
Well, yes. If I'm repeating myself, forgive me, but he was basically made the Governor General of Elba. And he was allowed to go with 1,000 troops and a small flotilla of boats, which is exactly how he came back to the mainland. But even on Elba during that short time, he started to impose modernizations that you enlightened us about last time, which was metrication and a civil code.
Yep.
These are subjects on which he was very, very keen. And it may be fair to say rather enlightened. But
yes. And so I think we move on to the 100 days, don't we, as it's known?
Well, we do. The Bourbons are back on the throne.
So that's the French royalty, not a chocolate biscuit for dunking in your tea.
No.
I'm just clarifying.
You just mind your Garibaldi's, okay?
Yeah.
Marshal Ney, who you mentioned likening him to me, or the other way round last time, was red-headed, was not rotund, and his only real failures were he was a complete turncoat.
Yeah.
Because he then sided with Louis, whoever it was.
The king.
And once they heard that Napoleon was preparing to land on the mainland, Ney infamously said, "I'll bring him back to you in a cage, sire." And then set off to the south of France, whereupon history tells us he confronted Napoleon. He ordered his troops to fire upon Napoleon and his men. They couldn't do it and wouldn't do it. And then just shouting, "Vive la France," and they all got together.
And so Ney went back to being a very important marshal or general for Napoleon.
Yes, he did, because Napoleon, although he'd heard of Ney's announcement, you talk about realpolitik, Napoleon needed him.
Yeah. And then he marched up through France, and I think this is possibly one of the most extraordinary things that Napoleon. It showed how the French viewed him. That he walked up through France. He, without any conflict, walked into Paris, the king having fled. And within a very short space of time, as I say, it was 100 days, the whole thing. He had reacquired a very significant army.
Yes, which had really rather swelled as he went up through France.
Yeah.
I think it was a combination, Richard, frankly, of his popularity as a figurehead and the unpopularity of the monarchs. The French were, the French were inherently Republican by this stage.
Yeah, well, they'd been chopping their heads off for a couple of decades before, hadn't they?
Quite so. And we must remember, as you reminded us last time, that Napoleon began as a revolutionary Republican officer.
Yeah.
So he was steeped in all of that. And yeah, so we have the 100 days.
Yeah, and just dealing with that point, there's an interesting study in the cult of personality. And there are other historical figures who somehow are able to grab the zeitgeist. I know that's a slightly pompous word, but they're able to persuade people by force of their personality to do things. Now, I know somebody who's like that, who persuaded me that I ought to come and do bloody broadcasts when I met him on a pub.
I'm just meek.
Yes, of course you are. Of course you are, Keith.
Incidentally, before we move on and I forget about it, Did you know that you live within half a mile of a direct descendant of the French royal family?
Tell me.
Well, he lives just around the corner from you. And if you would like, at some stage, I'll organize having a drink with him. You might find him fascinating to talk to.
Yeah, no, that would be. Does he wear a crown or
No,
you know?
but there are very few of them left.
I was going to say, yeah, a lot of them, you know,
Yeah.
had their heads. Now, Philip, just this question: Napoleon gets to Paris. He's got a big army. France is his again. Does he need to do anything further, or should he have just at that point consolidated and said, "I'm going to secure the borders because I'm aware that there will be those who will seek to get rid of me, but I believe that if we fight in France, where the people are on my side, we would succeed." Do you think he should have done that, or was it right that, as it were, he took the initiative and invaded Belgium?
He should not have invaded Belgium. He should have done exactly what you just illustrated or described, but he couldn't resist it.
No.
It was in his nature. He was on the crest of a wave. His ego was probably the biggest it had ever been, and he just couldn't resist it. And he wanted to get Great Britain off the map.
Yeah.
Somebody
should have just said to him, "You're going to invade Belgium. Have you ever been to Belgium? It's not worth invading, mate." It's sort of a city made up of places like Basildon. Don't do it, pal. But of course he did.
Yes, because he didn't listen to advisors.
No.
And it's endemic or inherent in all of these people, Hitler, Stalin, and currently Putin. It's
Mao
all to
Zedong.
show that he didn't and wouldn't have listened.
No.
And even at Waterloo itself, he kept insisting, in the face of obvious defeat, that he would turn things round, as he had done in previous battles, to be fair.
Yeah.
Combination of his hemorrhoids, as you pointed out, and being literally dragged off the field, where they were trounced when Blucher arrived.
Yeah. So, you've covered a lot of ground there, Philip. So, the French.
Well, I'm trying to get it all out before you interrupt me.
I don't want you to get anything out, Phil.
No. Well, you wouldn't notice anyway.
No. So he's played his poker hand. He's crossed into Belgium. Wellington is in Brussels. The Prussians are coming over from Central Europe with Blucher there.
But are they? That was the big mystery.
Yeah, and Wellington didn't know that. And Wellington did have a concern that if the French, as it were, if you think of a map of Belgium, it's a bit like the D-Day thing, that if the French had gone up the west coast, there was a risk that the British army would have been cut off from any possible retreat.
Yeah, the other concern was that he felt Blucher would come in on the side of the winner.
Well, but Blucher wasn't the problem. It was a couple of his generals that were the real skeptics about Wellington, who didn't think that Wellington would fight. But of course, we know that Wellington, including Waterloo, never lost a battle.
Correct.
Extraordinary record. And some years before, apparently, he'd been traveling through Belgium. Again, why you go to Belgium, I don't know. You know, maybe you want some chocolate, but I can't think of any reason you'd be there. Or play a saxophone or something, I don't know. And he saw what was the battlefield that is called Waterloo. It's not technically. Waterloo is about 2 miles north of it. And he said at the time, previously, he said that would be a great place to defend because it's that, you know, there's a slope there behind which infantry can lie down and not get caught by artillery fire, and then stand up and attack back. So he'd had that in mind for some time.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of minor battles before Waterloo where the British army defeated a French army. But the Prussians, who were by then slightly to the east, or quite a way to the east, lost. And as a consequence, Wellington had to fall back to Waterloo because otherwise his army would have been exposed. And, you know, we talk about a British army. It wasn't really a British army, was it, Philip?
It was predominantly, I suppose, British, but it was there were many Irish, and there were inevitably some mercenaries as well.
Well, there was a big formal Dutch contingent, for example, wasn't there?
Now, I didn't know that, so now you're educating me. I didn't know the Dutch.
And there was and the Dutch were a bit hopeless. There was also a German contingent, not non-Prussian, so the smaller Germanic states, who had allied themselves for some time with the British Army, who did fight really well. But I think the most impressive thing about Wellington then was he was in Brussels. He knew that Napoleon was over the border, was aiming for Brussels. And he'd gone and had this battle and then had to get his troops back. And that, you know, that involves a lot of logistics. But the night before Waterloo, Lady Whatnot, I can't remember her name, because there were lots of British aristocracy who were, you know, just there because they thought we're going to win this. She threw a ball.
That's right. I think she threw a ball in Brussels.
Yeah. And he attended throughout.
He did.
And gave no indication that there was a problem so as to avoid panic. And then at the end of the evening, he left the ball and he stayed up all bloody night dealing with those logistical issues that a general would have to do to settle his troops and all that sort of thing, so that they were perfectly ready on the morning of Sunday, the 18th of June, 1815, to face the advancing French troops. And it was a masterstroke on his part, because had there been panic, Belgium would have been lost. You know, people will have fled. So he was a ruthless man, Wellington, but he was a clever tactician. Now, in terms of the battle itself, I think we've touched upon this. Napoleon wasn't very well.
He wasn't. I thought it was ongoing stomach cancer. You tell me it was hemorrhoids, but it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Yeah, and it was a very wet summer, and he'd been riding his horse for days, up through France and then on. And he clearly had a fever of some kind. And most of the Battle of Waterloo, he didn't actually command at all. It was Marshal Ney, his second in command.
Whose great mistake was being lured into cavalry charges.
Yep.
Up a hill, at the top of which Wellington had put the notorious British squares.
And just explain to us what a British square is, Philip.
Well, it is literally a square-shaped formation of soldiers.
Yeah. With
different lines within it that allow almost continuous fire at 360 degrees.
So you have three lines of infantry. The first lot simply dig their rifles. In fact, it's not rifles, it's muskets in the ground with a bayonet on the end of them.
Yep.
Up at an angle to stop the cavalry. Horses won't go near that. As long as you trust the people on your left and right, because otherwise it would fall apart. And then you have two lines of people firing their muskets behind, one of them firing, the other one loading. So it's a continuous volley.
Yep. And then there's a central core where the officers are generally.
Yeah.
And they will have their own firearms.
Yeah.
And there wasn't just one square. So
no, there are about 28 squares.
Yeah. And so Ney had nowhere to go.
No.
It was what in the First World War became known as enfilade. In other words, it was just constant diagonal cross firing, and was very destructive.
And
certainly as far as the cavalry were concerned,
yes,
on which Napoleon relied hugely,
and
that was very much the beginning of the end.
Yeah, because Ney, as I understand it from what I've read, nobody quite knows how many charges there were by the heavy cavalry, the French cavalry with the big metal breastplates and the massive horses and their sabres. It was probably about 19, people seem to think. 19 times Ney failed to see that he was not going to break these squares. And indeed, throughout the Peninsular War, which we know came earlier, and at Waterloo, no British square was ever broken.
No, it wasn't. And that led to Wellington's ability at the consummation, if that's the right word, of the battle, when Napoleon or Ney sent in the Old Guard as the absolute last throw of the dice.
Yeah.
Because of the squares and their survival, Wellington had enough firepower, and using the terrain, as you said, so the Old Guard, in all its splendor and closed ranks, had no idea that just over the crest of that slope were hundreds, if not more than hundreds, of British muskets about to mow them down like a machine gun.
Yeah, it was Napoleon who mustered himself to lead that last stage of the battle.
Yes.
And it's said that he simply lied to the troops and said, look, they've run away.
Yeah.
The British have run away. There's nobody there. Let's march across the battlefield. Take it.
Whether he lied is very much a moot point. Part of Wellington's tactics that you have described was to let the opposition think they had been a retreat.
Yeah.
In my opinion, it's perfectly possible that Napoleon fell for that.
I think he had form for geeing up his troops at previous
Well,
battles.
that's one thing. Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll never know.
No. Well,
The end result is what
Keith
matters.
interviewed him, but just simply didn't ask the question.
Yeah.
That's the problem. And of course, the Prussians came in from the east eventually and helped mop up.
But the most brutal part of the battle was there was a farm on the edge of the battlefield, and that changed hands something like 15 times, and the fighting was almost like Verdun. It just bled both sides dry.
Yeah,
I can't remember the name of the farm now.
I've just said it twice, Philip. Hugmont.
I didn't hear you.
Well, if you close your lips, you would hear me. It was called Hugmont, and it was the one farm building that was actually forward of the British line, and Wellington recognised that he had to hold it, regardless of the losses. And you're right, though, it was an extraordinarily bitter and bloody battle.
Did he get down in time?
There's a story about how the French were trying to get in through the main gates, big wooden gates, and they couldn't, and they had a sort of farrier, great, big, enormous Frenchman, who just went and attacked the door with an axe and managed to break it open. And it was the guards who were in there, elite regiment, who managed to not only close the gates but also let some French in whom they killed, because that's what you do. Yeah. Absolutely brutal. Absolutely brutal.
Yeah, well, they were brutal times, and very little medical help, very little medical knowledge.
Is there any war that hasn't been brutal?
The War of Jenkins' Ear, which lasted about 44 minutes.
Yes, my favourite historical event.
Yeah. There was an event which, again, probably says more about Wellington, which is that his second in command was Lord Uxbridge. And Wellington, being a bit of a filthy old Keith, if I can put it that way, would go around.
Sorry, that's tautology. That's
true. That's true. Yeah.
That is triple tautology.
Yeah, no.
Dirty old Keith.
Yeah, no. Fair enough. And Wellington would go around toughing any young squeeze that he could get his hands on. One of whom was Lord Uxbridge's sister, so they had a tricky relationship because Uxbridge knew what was going on. But they were, during the course of the battle, on horseback next to each other, and a cannonball came along and hit Uxbridge.
He lost his leg.
Yeah, and he is reputed to have said, "By God, sir, I've lost my leg." And Wellington, not the most sympathetic of individuals, said, "By God, sir, you have."
And that is portrayed in the film Waterloo.
Is it?
Exactly.
Yeah. And that leg was salvaged by a local French peasant farmer who buried it in his back garden, and in years following charged people to come and see the grave of Lord Uxbridge's leg. That's enterprise, isn't it? There's something
that is very, very enterprising.
Yeah.
Again, in the film, Jack Hawkins plays a grisly commander of, I think, a very, very nasty Irish regiment who are absolute rogues. And Hawkins, who sadly, whatever rank he was, this chap, whose name I've never known, I think, he didn't wear uniform. He wore a top hat, a tailcoat, waistcoat, you name it. And that's how he fought his battles. And in the film, which I think is probably very accurate, there he is charging with these troops, calling them all the names under the sun to get them going. And then sadly, in his top hat and tails, he's shot. And one doesn't see him again. But there we are.
No, the story behind that is that he had rushed over from England to join, because he was a general, he wanted to join in the battle, and omitted to pack his uniform. And he didn't want to pursue that charge, but because of the politics of the quote British Army, there was, as I said, a significant Dutch contingent, and therefore there was a corps of troops who were under the command of this rather fey Dutch prince, who had, he had power over all those troops. And he told that general, off you go. You're going to go and charge them. And he knew he wasn't going to succeed, and actually said to his second in command, "Look, you wait here, but please go back and tell my family what's happened." And he knew he was, and he got shot through the middle of the head.
He did.
Yeah.
And then another excerpt from the film involved the Scots Highlanders.
Yep.
Because Wellington knew that they were hard as nails.
Yeah.
And their commander, dressed in his tam o'shanter and his kilt, reported to Wellington that they were almost out of ammunition. And Wellington said, "Well, you need to hold the French, you need to hold," and gave the commander a rather quizzical look. And the Scotsman said, "Oh, we'll hold." And indeed they did. Yeah. But it was hand-to-hand combat.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they were out of ammunition.
See you tomorrow, Kate.
And Napoleon, as you say, retreated off the battlefield with his Imperial Guard, his elite troops, protecting him. But they gradually dissipated. And as he headed south in his coach, he was finally caught. Wellington stayed near the battlefield. And I think it's a great quote from him, because he went and looked at the battlefield the next day, and you can imagine, there's corpses of men, corpses of horses. Even worse, there are people and horses who are fatally injured but not yet dead. And there are local peasants looting the corpses.
Correct.
And he said, there is only one thing worse than losing a battle, and that is winning a battle. And you can see what he meant. He meant you lose a battle, you run off, you don't see the aftermath. Whereas if you win it and you take the battleground, you then have to see the consequences for the people concerned.
And that is exactly what Lincoln did at Gettysburg.
Yep.
Lincoln, and again, I'm taking it from the film, so it could be rubbish, but I don't think it is. Lincoln went to Gettysburg and on his horse roamed the battlefield, looking at all the dead, with his hat in his hand, in the same way.
here's a mildly interesting little factoid, which is when they had a memorial service for that, there was a senator who spoke and made a speech for 2 3/4 hours about
like one of yours then.
Yeah. And then Lincoln got up and spoke 271 words, the Gettysburg Address.
Like my speeches, yes.
Yeah. So it lasted about...
Brief, succinct, to the point.
Phil. Yeah, Jesus.
Don't go segue on us.
Tell me, before we go any further and get into the United States, what is your view on the TV series Sharp?
I've never watched it, Keith, I confess. I've read the books.
I think I watched one episode and was very unimpressed, personally.
Yeah. So what do you do with Napoleon? You've got him. He's already proved to be a little rat who is able to escape from his cage on the Mediterranean. There were significant calls from members of the Allied forces to have him executed. Ney was executed. And it was the British who said, no, we're not going to kill him.
Well, Ney was executed by the French.
Yes, yeah. For being, as you say,
a turncoat.
A turncoat. So what do you do with Napoleon? And it is a relatively clever answer. Is you say, Napoleon, good news, we're not going to kill you. Bad news, we're going to send you on HMS Bellerophon, a Royal Navy ship, and they're going to sail you to St. Helena, which is over 1,000 miles from any other land, and it's effectively a rock, mid-Atlantic, and you're going to stay there for the rest of your life. And he did.
Which wasn't very long. He died at 51.
Yeah, he certainly died before. Well, and of course, Wellington went on and became Prime Minister, and I've no doubt was still keithing the women throughout that time. And that that there are a lot of conspiracy theories, as there always are, about famous people as to how they died. And nobody really knows. But one of the theories, which I think is lovely, is that he lived in a house with wallpaper that had a green paint design on it, which contained arsenic. And so over time, he...
now called Keithnick.
Yeah, now called Keithnick. You're absolutely right. I did touche, Phil. For you, that's very good, if I may say.
Don't patronise me, Barton.
I won't patronise you. And he was buried on St. Helena, and then he, in due course, some years later, was taken and buried in Les Invalides in Paris, in some splendour, because the French always like a French hero.
Tell me, I had the privilege of being able to see fairly regularly the last painting that Wellington ever had made of himself, to which he commented it actually almost made him look handsome. Was he, in fact, not a very good-looking man?
No, well, he had a big old hook nose, but I'm sure the ladies of the time thought, he's got a big nose. You know what that means. He himself is an interesting character because he came from very, very minor aristocracy, but they were Irish.
Yeah, Anglo-Irish aristocracy, yeah.
Yeah, And he joined the British Army and went to India. And it was for many years, certainly around that time, considered to be very much a second-class citizen who spent their time or who obtained their commission as an Indian officer, as opposed to what they might perceive as a proper British officer. I think on that score, he probably got the last laugh.
Very, very arguable.
Well,
I think you're on solid ground there, Barton.
Yeah, greatest British general ever.
As a British general, purely, yes.
Yeah.
Hence that magnificent memorial to him that I saw in the Guildhall.
Yes.
Which is truly awesome.
Yes, and the statue of him in Waterloo Place that is next to the Duke of York's column, who was undoubtedly one of the worst that we ever had.
Yes, yes, that's true. That is true. Philip, we have touched upon last time the similarities of the mistakes that Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler made. The attempt to invade Britain, which failed. The invasion of Russia, which was a disaster, leading to the loss of an army and the loss of power. Who would you say was the bigger villain?
Well, in terms of the sheer scale of the brutality and the genocide, Hitler.
Yeah, I can see that. I suppose it might be said that in the early part of the 19th century, there simply wasn't the means to kill on that scale.
No, you're quite right, but the lack of means, there, to my knowledge, there is no historical suggestion that Napoleon intended genocide.
No, not at all.
Or any of his countrymen intended genocide. I mean, they were harsh, particularly in the Iberian Peninsula stuff.
Yeah,
they were very harsh in who they executed. There is that amazing portrait of Spanish guerrillas being executed by French soldiers that typifies exactly how horrific it must have been.
Yeah.
So with Hitler, everything stemmed from Hitler, and everything stemmed from Mein Kampf, and everything stemmed from his hatred of the Jews.
Yeah,
which predated any power he ever had.
No, that's true. That is all true. I accept all of that. But just looking at our subject, Napoleon, it's odd how over the passage of time, and we're now talking about 200 years, people's views on somebody like him rather soften. And, the reason we're talking about this is because of a film that's come out, and the fact that his bicorn hat was sold at auction. And everybody says, oh, that's Napoleon. And it rather ignores the fear that he caused to Europe and the damage that he did.
Because only those who experienced it can remember it. It's stating the obvious, but
yeah.
If you and I had been alive during the Second World War in the early 1940s, I would have been shit scared. I'm sure you would have been scared, because in retrospect, we know what would have happened had the Nazis succeeded in invading the British Isles.
Yeah, we lost my grandfather in the Second World War. He headed up to the Glen and then finally came back in 1945 when he found out the war was over.
You had me going there. I was about.
I know.
I was about to commiserate with you.
No, yeah. One little odd supposed fact.
Can you not lean so close to the camera? It's very shocking.
No, that's my face.
Well, I know that.
It is claimed by a female professor at the University of Utah.
Yeah.
That when Napoleon died and he had his post-mortem, and this bit is probably provable, for reasons that aren't completely clear, they cut his genitals off. And this professor claims that this modestly sized jar of formaldehyde that she has on her desk contains Napoleon's penis. We'll never know. But I was just thinking, that when the time finally comes.
Oh, I know where this is going.
No. I was just going to say, and hopefully it will be many years hence. And we have to.
You sod.
No, and we have to say goodbye to Keith. I don't think the small jar of formaldehyde would suffice. I think we're looking at a fish tank.
Well, I think you're right, because I would stand proud and erect.
Seriously, I wish we hadn't done that Carry On film discussion, because it's unleashed something quite dark in Keith.
Well, one of the jokes in the comedian's retro I saw, was the chap who bought a very smart pair of shoes, and he went home to his wife, and she didn't notice the shoes, or purported not to notice the shoes, and he got rather cross about this. So he began by stripping off his upper clothing and then started dancing around the room and doing sort of tap dancing with these new shoes. And she still remained completely unmoved. So he then removed all of his clothing but kept the shoes on and paraded around in flagrante delicto, whatever you call it. And she said, "What are you doing? Showing me, here I am having to look at you naked for no reason, with that great thing between your legs dangling down, pointing to the ground." And he said, "They're not pointing to the ground. They're pointing to my new shoes, which you haven't noticed." And she said, "Well, very nice. But next time, do us both a favour and buy a new hat."
Dear, oh dear. Yeah. Phil, when they have stand-up mic nights at comedy clubs?
Open mic, yeah.
Yeah. I'd swerve it if I were you, pal.
I would never even dream of doing that. And if I wanted to be amused, I'd just come watch you in court.
You're very kind. Thank you. I like to think I entertain. Yeah. I think we're just about there, aren't we, gents?
59 minutes, 15 seconds and counting.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, could I go back to the top of the conversation?
Yes, of course.
Because somebody who I did not only meet but became a friend was the real 007, who was a very interesting and charming chap, and who had two beautiful daughters. But the first time I met him, I was introduced to an older man named Gus, and Gus was the original M. So it was a sort of I enjoyed actually his real name was John. I enjoyed John very much, and I knew him 3 or 4 years before he actually died, and he was a fascinating character with a real background.
Keith, you are such a name dropper and a trouser dropper, come to think of
it. I'm not counting.
No. I'm sure you do know, but Ian Fleming wrote the villain Blofeld because he'd gone to school with somebody of that name who had bullied him. And that chap was the father of the cricket commentator, Henry.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No, I didn't know that. That's an interesting... Yeah.
And father of the judge who became Mr. Justice Blofeld.
Absolutely right. Absolutely.
Who began to sit at St. Albans Crown Court in my young days.
Yep.
So the same family.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And you know, I'm sure you do know, Ian Fleming became unwell and he was told by his medics, look, you have to go and recuperate somewhere. So he came down to Brighton, stayed in a hotel, and his doctor has said, there's no writing James Bond books. It's too stressful. So what did he write instead?
Bang bang.
Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Yes.
Yeah.
Just as a final comment, can I say to you that I think that the best Bond book, not the movie because they butchered it, absolutely butchered it, but the best Bond book was The Spy Who Loved Me, in which James Bond does not come into the novel until halfway through.
Yes.
And to me, it is a lovely description of the England of perhaps the 1950s, 1960s, and I think a delightful book.
Now you're aware that Philip can't read, so would you mind bringing your copy along next time and just read it out?
I've actually got 2 or 3 copies because I was so fond of it. Anyway, you're right. We now have gone 102 minutes and 49 seconds.
We've gone 62 minutes.
Yeah.
Very well, then. I will translate
1 hour, 2 minutes. Yeah. Keith, I'm going to pop along and see you along with a friend of yours in a little while, if that's okay.
I shall look forward to it. Absolutely. Yeah.
Lovely.
Philip, thank you. I know that the 2 of you got, or Philip, you particularly, have got important things to do tomorrow. So that your fans will find a piece of a gap in the schedule, but I'm sure that you'll make up for that on Monday.
Yeah,
we intend to. Did you get, as I know Richard got, I emailed you a scan of an article on the siege of Arundel in the Civil War, Keith? Did you see that on your email?
No, I didn't, but I'd be very fascinated to see that, because one of my favorite stories, which I've written and been published, is the Battle of Haywards Heath.
Yeah.
Which derived specifically from Arundel and the attempts of the Royalists to attack Lewis. So I shall read that with some considerable interest.
Well, I know it will have got you because it got to Richard.
It got to me. Yeah.
And it was on the same email.
Well, I shall look back through that. But when did you send it? Within the last 24 hours?
I sent it yesterday morning.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't seen it yet, but I will. I'll take a look.
Well, if you tell me on a text you haven't got it, I'll forward it to you again.
Yes, please do, because my understanding is that that the royalists were forced out because the Cromwellians very cleverly cut off their water supply.
Oh, I'm worse. Yeah, they literally flushed them out. It was a siege. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I shall read that with great interest. The English Civil War, I'm particularly interested in, actually, and of course, there is a lot that happened in Lewis and this part of the coast in the battles.
Are you staying on air whilst Richard is visiting you, or will you be shutting down?
I'm going to shut down for half an hour, and then John Henty should be along to do a half hour.
All right. Well, enjoy Richard's company.
Lovely to see you both. Yeah.
There we are. Is a very in-depth and interesting, for those who are historically inclined, a tale of Napoleon and some of the things that took place, which I didn't know, and I'm sure you didn't, in the English Civil War. So we'll leave you for half an hour, and we'll be back some stage in the not too distant future with John Henty. As I said, today is an exceptional day. We normally show the recording of yesterday today, but we had the opportunity to have the two boys along and to have John along, and so we have a special program, if you like. And it is now 9:38. We'll be back somewhere around 10 o'clock. So for the moment, toodle pip. And yes. From Lewis in the Black Horse